Welcome to the Argue With Me podcast. In this episode, I have a rather lively conversation with Phil Magness, who has co written a paper with Michael Makovi called The Mainstreaming of Marx. Fantastic paper, super interesting. We get into the synthetic um, Karl Marx that he constructed out of Google Ngram data. I hope I'm not making that sound boring. In fact, it's you'll be interested. I guarantee it. But we don't just talk about that. We talk about Karl Marx in general. What was his life like? Did anybody like him? Who likes him now? Why does anybody like him? Why is he famous? Um, uh, all of these things. We begin to hit contemporaries, mentions of Karl Marx in certain sources, and that sort of thing. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, welcome to the Argue With Me podcast. I'm really excited to have with me Phil Magness, a co-author on the paper Mainstreaming Marx, which appears in the prestigious Journal of Political Economy, I think it is.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not an academic, so I know the journal is prestigious. I sometimes forget these things. And your co-author was Michael Makovi.
Yes.
To get a nice tip of the hat to Michael before I forget to do that. Um, Phil is newly with the Independent Institute, and he is the David Thoreau Chair there. So congratulations on the new gig.
Thank you.
All right. I assume you'll still be thinking about many of the same issues at the Independent Institute.
That is exactly the plan.
Oh, thank goodness. Okay, good. I don't want to scare anybody to think that you're moving into something totally unrelated when you're doing such a good job at what you're doing. So today, Phil and I are going to talk about that paper, Mainstreaming Marx, and Marx more generally. I think we should probably start by just talking about Marx a little bit to make your paper make more sense, right? And
Yeah.
um, I guess the way I'll start this conversation out is that I did a little experiment of my own. Nothing very rigorous, but I just went on YouTube over the past couple days to see if I could find any pro Marx videos. So videos that are very positive about the man. And it was very easy. In fact, those
Yes.
videos have millions and millions and millions of views. Um, so one, let's say I was 18 and I'm running into Marx the first time. I would think this man is a genius. He must have always been thought of as a genius. What a nice man. He wants to give all the workers all of this good stuff. And what might be misleading about the popularity, or should we go back and just say, how did Marx start out? Was he popular from the start?
No, Marx actually is a very fringe figure in his own lifetime, barely even known outside of other intellectual circles on the political left, and really the far political left. So not anyone that's really entering into mainstream competition with major intellectual figures of his day. There's a famous story. He lived in London in the same neighborhood as John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill was kind of like this man about town, knew everyone who was everyone in British society, was a member of parliament, an acclaimed philosopher, one of the leading figures of his day. He lives in the same neighborhood as Karl Marx, and there's no reference to Karl Marx anywhere in his writings. So you
Right.
use that as kind of a proxy measure of where Marx was in his own lifetime. And Marx dies in 1883, and I think it's fair to say he dies in relative obscurity. The other famous story, and this comes from Frederick Engels, there's only about a dozen people that show up at his funeral. And Engels, of course, is just uh, completely saddened and at the loss of his great friend and mentor. And telegraphs, he sent a telegram all over the world announcing that the great Karl Marx is dead. And most newspapers perceive this and like, who? They have no idea who this guy is. And those that do report on it basically treat him as if he's this far left socialist agitator that really hadn't accomplished anything. Marx is known today for two books in particular, although he writes quite a bit beyond that. And that's the Communist Manifesto, which he first writes in 1848. And then about 20 years later, Capital or Das Kapital, he publishes the first volume of that. And there are two posthumous volumes that get published to that, but neither of them is particularly well known in his lifespan. The Communist Manifesto actually arrives a little bit too late to the party. It was written in response to some revolutionary movements that broke out across Europe in 1848, but it's in kind of an editing phase as those revolutions are phasing down. And the only reason we even know of it or think about it today is they revived it 25 years later in the wake of the Paris Commune, and it started to become kind of a doctrine on the left. It's like, oh, remember this pamphlet we had from decades ago?
Yeah. So okay, so I'm going to go into side quest mode for one
Yeah.
second here, based on a couple of things you said. Marx, London, not a British name.
Mm-mm.
How do you end up there?
Yeah, so Marx is from Germany,
Yeah.
and he is constantly involved in political agitation movements in the European continent. And the first couple of decades of Marx's life, and really his early entry into adulthood, so he comes up through an academic channel, but he associates with all these various radical revolutionary political movements, and he just keeps getting kicked out of country after country after country. He finally lands in London, which in the 19th century, Britain was relatively liberal in its toleration of free speech. So they kind of let him take up his position there, but he's promptly ignored.
Wait a
He,
minute. So are you telling me that this guy who is an academic and he's been in all these different countries in Europe and you know uh, he just cares about people so much, Phil, that he's writing about how, disadvantaged they are, and only 12 people bothered to show up to his funeral. What about his doctoral advisor? What
oh
about
yeah,
any
well they're long dead by then,
Oh, that's a good
but
point. Yeah.
he's basically forgotten in that sense. You know, he's noticed. There was a famous quip. I think it's the historian C. Northcote Parkinson is writing about Marx's legacy about the time that he died in 1883, and he said, "Yeah, he was a socialist agitator, but he wasn't even enough of an agitator for the police to pay attention to him."
Right. So, is it fair to say, and I actually don't know the answer to this question, so I don't mean it as a leading question. Is it fair to say that this is just my suspicion though, the only person he could remain friends with was the guy he depended on for money?
That's basically it. I mean,
Yeah.
Marx has a notorious track record of getting into feuds with former allies. And I mean, very, very bitter feuds in which they start throwing insults at each other and banish each other from their competing organizations. It's the scene from Monty Python's Life of Brian with the People's Front of Judea versus the People's Judean Front. That's just communist organizations in the 19th century, and it's also Marxist organizations after he died, because you get all these competing interpreters that declare the other interpreters of Marx as heretics.
Right. Okay. And we'll come back to that about the competing interpretations of Marx, and one in particular, I'm sure. Um, but before we move on to that, so what kind of thing? I mean, I'm poking a little fun here about, oh, he cares about the workers and that sort of thing. It's not hard to find people now that really might genuinely care about the workers, but it's I guess so. What is the theory, like the academic side of Marx's caring about the workers? How does he figure all that out?
Yeah, so Marx comes from an economic tradition and a philosophical tradition that are both very wedded to the 19th century. He's a Hegelian, so he's a follower of GFW Hegel, major German philosophical figure of the early 19th century, although he falls on the left side of the Hegelian spectrum because they're both left-wing and right-wing Hegelians. So he's clearly bringing that to bear, and this is where his conceptualization of history, historical progress comes from. And he pairs that with ideas that come out of classical economics or classical political economy. And that in particular is the labor theory of value. The idea that work performed on something to improve it is what instills it with its value. He pairs these two things together in some interesting ways. I mean, they're fairly typical of the way that a mid 19th century thinker might have approached these issues. But he notices that the value that is a good is selling for is often well in excess of what a laborer is paid for making that good. And if you adopt the labor theory of value, then the laborer should receive the amount of value added. If you're turning a pile of wood into a piece of furniture, you improve it, you can sell it at a higher price than a raw pile of wood. That improvement is the value that you have instilled through your work. And he says that a laborer is owed that, basically. But he looks around and he says, well, the owners of capital actually charge a much higher price than what they pay their workers to produce these things. And he says the difference between these two, the wage paid and the price that they charged effectively, or at least in practice, is what he calls surplus value. And then he starts thinking we can jump from surplus value as this economic concept into social theory. And he says that surplus value is essentially a demonstration that exploitation has occurred. The worker's been uh, used, taken advantage of. They aren't getting the full recompense of what they have put into producing something. That surplus value is what is owed to them, but it's actually paid to the owner of capital. Or the rentier that owns the factory, or someone who's not really doing any work, is just providing the property that allows that work to be permitted. And he says that this exploitation is what leads workers to feel like that they have been abused effectively. And he says it explains factory conditions around 19th century Britain. And then he jumps into there an even deeper social theory. He looks around and he says, well, the workers are far more numerous than the owners of capital. So he concludes from that that it's basically inevitable if all the workers are being exploited. And he says there are certain processes that play out that tend toward greater exploitation and immiseration over time. He says as all the workers are being exploited, they'll eventually rise up and seize the means of production for themselves. And the socialist state that he desires is therefore not something that we even have to drive forward to accomplish. It's something that's inevitable. The process of
Now,
history will steer it toward that.
now I want to ask. I mean, there's a few things I want to ask you about, but just that last thing you were just
Mhm.
saying, I want to stick on for a second. So, is it the case that Marx is merely saying, "Look, here's what I think is inevitable," right? Which I don't think this is the case, but that this is all he's saying.
Yeah.
He's not just making an observation. I think this is bound to happen. He's advocating that this happens,
Oh
right?
yeah,
It's
he's
yeah,
saying that we
yeah.
should seize the revolutionary moment. And some later interpreters of him they refer to this as the vanguard notion. Although you see in the Communist Manifesto, he says it should be the intellectuals of the Communist Party, i.e., himself and Engels, who provide the intellectual framing that tell the workers what they need to do at the time of the revolution. And you see this over Marx's career. This is why he keeps getting kicked out of countries all over Europe. Is every time there's even the slightest rumor of a revolution occurring, it's like this Marx guy shows up and starts blathering theory and propaganda to
Okay,
encourage the revolution along
I
and say,
have
this is our moment.
I have to ask, did he ever show signs or did anybody ever notice that this guy Marx, the only place that would take him was the most capitalist place on the planet at the time?
Right.
Did that never dawn on him? Or
I mean, it's interesting, and even more so than that, his main patron is Engels,
yeah.
and Engels is the son of a wealthy textile manufacturer in
Right.
Manchester, who basically has like this ne'er-do-well son, and he keeps saying, "Well, we're going to give you a job. You can manage the factory." And quit hanging out with these weird academic friends. This guy Carl that is just basically sponging off of you for money. We want you to manage the factory, do something productive with your life. But what Anglos actually does is he starts channeling money that he makes from his role as a factory manager
Of
to become
course.
Marx's patron.
It's
So
for the greater good. So okay, so getting back a little bit to the some of the more technical stuff you said without my interjecting with a snide observation. What is wrong with this whole surplus value labor theory of value, which I know he's not the only one. I think you mentioned it too, that the labor theory of value itself was not that weird at the time. A
right,
lot
right.
of people thought,
It
yeah,
long predates him. He's not the first theorist of it, although he just seizes on it and makes it the centerpiece of his economics. I mean, there are arguments that there are signs of the labor theory of value in Adam Smith, but Adam Smith's economic system is not contingent on labor theory of value, whereas Karl Marx's is. And he's quite explicit about that in both his writings and his public lectures. So the issue that emerges here is the labor theory of value actually isn't a very good functional explanation of why goods attain value in the marketplace. And there's some classic paradoxes that emerge that earlier economists were aware of. David Ricardo, who's one of the preeminent expositors and developers of labor theory of value lines of reasoning before Marx, actually starts to notice that wine in casks, labor performed on smashing up grapes and putting them in wine casks is basically the same regardless of where you are, and it's only the aging that differentiates the product slightly. But he also notices that different regions of the world, wine sells for a very high dollar amount, or it sells for almost nothing at all. Even though it's the exact same process that goes into making it, and it turns out that there's a premium wine from the Bordeaux region of France is going to be much more desirable by more people than a wine from northern Scotland. Uh,
Thank you for working my last name into this, Phil. I appreciate that. But yeah, 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 yeah. Okay, so I mean, and ultimately, he's got these paradoxes. I mean, he's got labor as an input to something that he's trying to also explain the price of.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah, and this is a paradox that emerges when he's writing Capital. So he's got his labor theory of value. There's problem number one. Problem number two is he's got a circularity in his own argument. It's referred to in some of the literature as a transformation problem. So labor is a priced input, but it's also a priced good onto itself. And to basically perform a calculation for economic planning, you need to know both pieces of information simultaneously, but you can't do that when one's contingent on the other. You just devolve into a mathematical circularity. So he's got some real problems with this theory. On the theory of value, it starts to be labor theory of value starts to be challenged in Marx's own lifetime. Other economists come along and they examine all these paradoxes. They notice, well, there's the wine issue that David Ricardo mentioned. There's another famous paradox about diamonds versus water. And it turns out that diamonds we think of as these really rare and valuable things. Water is abundant everywhere, but it turns out they're very circumstance specific. If you're in the middle of the Sahara Desert, diamonds are basically worthless, but water is worth a whole lot. If you're in a street in downtown London, water's probably pretty abundant and easy to obtain. But if you have a bag of diamonds, you may be the richest guy in the city. So you got different types of situations affect the point of trade, the point of exchange that occurs. And then you can also do thought experiments, because if you were offered the question, would you rather have a bottle of water or a bag of diamonds? Most people would take a bag of diamonds. But if you rephrase that and said, would you rather have all the water in the world or all the diamonds in the world? Everyone would choose water because you need it to live.
yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah. So, you mentioned that some people in Marx's lifetime
Mhm.
had read some of his work at least. So I guess he's not totally unknown. It's he's an
Well,
anomaly, and
they're actually responding to other labor theory of value
oh, it's not
writers.
Marx
So
that they're
they're
responding.
responding more so to Ricardo.
Okay.
Marx is like this latecomer who's operating on the periphery.
Right.
So they're responding to the labor theory of value, and it's much more developed exposition that comes before Marx, and they basically notice that these paradoxes show it doesn't hold up. It's not a good explanatory device for how a good obtains this value. And the solution to that is they realize that value is actually interpersonal subjectivity occurs. I like red cars, you like green cars. I may be willing to pay more for a red car than you would for a red car, and you with a green car, or vice versa.
Right.
We all have individual preferences, and we also make our decisions about those preferences on the margin at the point of the next sale, the next exchange. If I already have two red cars, it's probably diminishing value for me to get a third one. On the other hand, if it's my first red car, that might be the one that I wanted to buy. And this applies to almost any type of good in any type of situation. It also explains, like in these extreme cases of like a natural disaster and bottled water is in short supply. Well, people do raise the price for it, but people are also more willing to pay for it because that's a different circumstance of exchange than just a random trip to Walmart in the afternoon.
Right.
Uh,
Oh,
so,
so here's a question. I'm actually a little embarrassed to admit this. I mean, I know obviously you're referring to Menger and
mhm.
the marginal value theory,
Yeah, yeah.
subjective value. Did Marx have access to that He must have had access to that information
Yeah.
when he was working on it. Does he ever bother to try to even deal with
He
it?
never really engages it.
No. Eh?
It's published in 1871. That's Menger writes in German and writes basically his textbook which has the solution to the diamond water paradox in German. Simultaneously in England, William Stanley Jevons solves the paradox as well. So it's two major works come out in Marx's lifetime in 1871. He lives another decade and he never really engages with them because he's so far down the path of the labor theory of value that it's like he's wedded to this false trajectory and he's following it to the very end.
Right. And on a common sense note too. I mean, like to believe the sorry, surplus value argument, you'd have to believe that in a way the consumer is a bit of a fool too, right?
Basically, yes.
Yeah. Does he ever like nobody none of, Marx and Engels never like, hey, should we bring that one up? Should
I
we
mean, there are elements and places where he rails against aspects of consumerism, and he rails against uh, basically what he's observing in his lifetime is the start of the emergence of the British middle class, and he thinks it's basically like a false veneer to obscure the fundamental contradictions of capitalism that he claims he's scientifically deduced. And he makes all these predictions. It says, over the course of time, workers are going to be increasingly immiserated and pushed down toward the bottom. And that's the mechanism that starts the revolution. But what we actually observe in practice is the poor are getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. Standards of living are going up, up, up in ways that are directly oppositional to what Marx would have predicted.
So yeah, that's interesting. So that's another part I was going to ask you about because like I said, I watched those videos about Marx that were all very positive,
Mhm.
and often they would mention, well, it's not like Marx just wanted to believe this stuff. He was doing a scientific analysis, and it's got like
Right.
sort of this reputation of being scientific. But you're bringing
Yeah.
up a bunch of things that a true scientist would have to put into their
Exactly.
Bayesian reasoning. So do you just refuse to follow the science, Phil? Like,
That's the thing.
what
I
is?
mean, Marx has this. He uses claims of being scientific as a rhetorical device in his work. He claims to have deduced a theory of history that shows a mechanical progression that can be exactly predicted as long as you understand the underlying laws. And in his lifetime, both Marx and some of his followers, they try to liken himself to Charles Darwin, understanding evolutionary mechanisms. Darwin's a contemporary. There's even a recorded instance where Marx mails Darwin a copy of Capital right after it comes out and says, I read your work on biology. Here's my work on economics. I think we're the same thing. You should read this. And Darwin basically writes him back in this blow off thank you letter. It's like, I received your book. I stuck it on the shelf over in the corner. It's the extent of it. So
That's interesting. I never heard that story. Okay.
So yeah,
Right.
he's constantly trying to present himself as a scientist, but you see in his work, the spirit of dogmatism is pervasive.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. So what happens then that I mean, here I am finding millions of views on these
Yeah,
Marx videos. I honestly, when I mean, I have a few university degrees, and I was never assigned Marx as
yeah,
for
yeah.
anything, but I understand that it does happen in certain departments, especially.
Very
Um,
much so. He's one of the most assigned texts, especially in the humanities classrooms. He is constantly jockeying for the position number one of the most assigned philosopher, with Plato being the other one, and no one else in the canon comes close to him.
Plato, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, yeah, they're just as good as one another. So
right.
yeah, so if I'm pretty sure, like if I walked out of this room and started talking to random people, they probably more of them would know who Karl Marx is than, like, for example, even probably even Adam Smith, who you mentioned,
Right,
which
right.
is just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Um, so how does this start to happen?
Yeah, well, it's actually the first few decades after Marx's death, and he passes away in 1883. Almost nobody comes to his funeral. There's a few radical socialists that, excuse me, sorry,
It's okay.
open allergies right now.
I'll cut that out.
But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So he dies in 1883. No, almost nobody comes to his funeral. There's a few devoted radical socialists around Engels and some of Engels' followers. that try to keep the spirit of Marx alive, but that's about it. And the only people that really start to notice him in any mainstream way are economists who stumble across this book, Capital, in the years after Marx's death, and probably it was his supporters just kind of pushing them on to economists and saying, "Look, wait, you need to pay attention to our theory. This is the way to go." And economists look at his book, they give it a very thorough and fair reading and conclude that it's basically obsolete nonsense.
Right.
Marginal revolution has undermined its core premise. The mathematical internal mechanisms of labor as both an input and output do not reconcile. And these, it's like a dual blow that comes together in the decade or so after Marx's death when economists are looking at his work and they give it very thorough consideration and conclude, yep, it's junk. So by the turn of the century, he's viewed as this obsolete peripheral author who had tried to contribute to a path that the economics discipline did not take and is basically written off into history. He's rejected. So
Just like Charles Darwin. Yeah, he was. Yeah,
yeah.
that's okay. So obviously, I mean, I'm dancing around this a little bit. Your paper is going to answer or try to provide evidence as to how Marx became popular, but something
Right.
must have caused you to start thinking about this question
Yeah, yeah.
anyway. So, what was you and Michael? What were you working on that got you thinking about all this stuff anyway?
So we had seen other suggestions by a number of other authors have said had mentioned this fact that Marx was fairly obscure after he died, and fairly obscure for several decades after he died. And we're sitting here kind of scratching our heads and looking over the evidences. It's very clear economists rejected Marx, and he goes on for a couple decades where he's seen as this very obscure peripheral figure. And yet, how do we reconcile that with the fact today that he's one of the most assigned texts in college textbooks? He's everywhere. He's considered like a dominant philosophical figure in multiple academic disciplines outside of economics. It's always the humanities department and sociology departments and things like that that adopt him, even though he wrote primarily in economics and identified himself as contributing to political economy. It's all these other disciplines that adopt him. So we're kind of scratching our heads as like, well, how do you get from obscure and rejected to everywhere in the course of a little over a century and a half?
Yeah,
So that's the big question that we had. And posited theories were we start seeing other references in the academic literature, although they're qualitative references. They say, well, something must have put Marx on the map. And the obvious candidate is the emergence of the Soviet Union in 1917, because they basically declared Marx as the state philosopher.
right. Okay, so we got a candidate here for explaining why Marx has become so popular because the Soviet Union adopted him as the state philosopher, and everyone knows the Soviet Union turned out very well. So that would propel him forward. But in all seriousness, how? Okay, you mentioned look. There's a few other socialist organizations,
Yeah.
other contemporaries of Marx that he couldn't get along with. How did he become the one out of all these socialists that gets to be the guy for the USSR?
Well, yeah, this is something we try to consider because in Marx's own lifetime, remember, it's the People's Judean Front versus the People's Front of Judea,
Yeah,
is how all these organizations operate. They're constantly exiling each other. They have factions and they declare each other heretics, and it's really in the periphery of society. So we started to look at some of the patterns of citations for Marx's contemporaries because there are other socialist traditions. Some of them are non-revolutionary. We call them today democratic socialism. The economics are still crazy, but at least they don't want to bring the mob out in the street and shoot everybody.
right.
So it's a slightly different tradition. One of Marx's contemporaries, Ferdinand Lassalle, for example, is a very prominent figure in the democratic socialist tradition of the 19th century. And probably in many sense, he's more famous than Marx was in his own lifetime. He died in the 1860s. He knew Marx. They wrote and corresponded with each other, and they had a huge falling out. Marx ends up saying some very nasty, derogatory things towards Lassalle, basically attacking Lassalle's ethnicity. He drops the N word several times in letters to
Oh boy.
describe LaSalle and says that, well, his error in understanding socialism must be due to his African ancestry, is basically the implication there.
And
So
and so modern leftists forgive this this
it's
in
shocking that Karl Marx has not been canceled. I mean, if there
wow,
was
yeah.
ever a candidate for cancellation, I mean, Marx is a flaming racist. You see that throughout
Hi.
his works. He
Huh.
likes racial slurs. He makes these weird proto-eugenic arguments about heredity. He very clearly looks down upon non-Europeans.
Oh, okay. What a lovely guy. Nobody
Yes,
showing up at his funeral doesn't like yeah, okay. All right. So I guess basically what you're saying is like there's a strong chance that his being selected by Lenin was ultimately
basically,
motivated.
yeah.
I mean,
It's like an accident of history.
he saw, but he saw like maybe he saw Proudhon and maybe he saw Bakunin, and it was like these guys are a little too nice.
Yes,
We're
yeah.
you know we're not gonna be able to cause any violence with these guys. But
That's a big part of it. I mean, Lenin
yeah,
is a devoted follower of Marx and a Marxist theoretician in his own right. He starts out in his own obscurity, but is debating other Marxists over who has the true interpretation of Marx.
right,
And Lenin emerges triumphant on that, and then just through chance accidents of history, finds himself thrust into the middle of St. Petersburg at a time of social unrest and turmoil. And what does he do? He seizes the crisis and, with a very, very small band of ruffians, basically topples and stages a coup d'etat of one of the world's most powerful governments.
right, okay. And so I don't know if we have to get into this deeply, but I think somebody who might be hearing that for the first time might wonder, like, well, how is it possible that like a few guys were able to just like topple an emperor or czar or whatever?
Yeah.
How did that how did that happen?
Well, it's a succession of missteps. So that there were already revolutionary ruminations going on in Russia before Lenin arrives on the scene. Russia's in a pretty bad shape at the tail end of World War One because the war has taken a toll on the population. There's mass starvation. The Tsar's armies are now, some of them are wandering back home and they're still armed and everything. So there's social unrest, and they it's basically other factions get the czar to abdicate. A government is set up, and this happens in early 1917 under Alexander Kerensky, that is like a quasi-republican form of government. It has some socialist elements, some non-socialist elements, but they're trying to set up a new state to replace the czar. And the issue here is that it was a very weak form of government organization. There are a lot of people that are just extremely disorganized. And in the middle of all this, Germany decides that, the war is still ongoing. Germany decides that in order to win the Western Front, they need to eliminate the threat of Russia on the Eastern Front. So they find this ruffian that's taken refuge in Switzerland. That's Lenin,
Right.
and basically put him on a train and give him diplomatic passage into Russia as just like this troublemaker who they know he's going to go there and cause problems that will weaken the Russian war front. Russia
He's
leaves the war, and then Germany can
wait,
continue fighting
he's
on the West.
he's a bioweapon.
Basically, yeah, he's a
Yeah.
bioweapon. It turns out he's a little too good of a bioweapon, and he
Yeah.
gets in there, and not only does he neutralize Russia, but then he waits for a moment when the successor government, the Kerensky government, was weak, and basically gets a band of armed guards and storms in, stages a coup d'état, seizes power. And it's not an instantaneous, like now he's the emperor of Russia or the new government of Russia. He had seized the seat of power, and this launches a 5 year civil war
Hmm.
where the opposition forces are like, well, who's this crazy Bolshevik guy that's seizing our government? We try to organize ourselves, and the war is really just a comedy, a tragic comedy of missteps, because the commanders on the other side, they're plagued by incompetence, they're plagued by betrayal and infighting. There are all these what ifs of history. I mean, there's like a dozen different moments in the Russian Civil War where one output outcome could have just slightly gone the other direction, or somebody missed a train, or somebody was in the wrong city at this exact moment,
Right.
and that collapsed the opposition. And then basically you have this unscrupulous, willing to murder and do whatever it takes character in Lenin, who just runs amok and eventually seizes control of the country.
Wow. Okay. So, and this is something. This is not a big digression, but this is something I've wondered a few times, and maybe you just have some thoughts on it. Like, I read, like, for example, something that Brian Kaplan or Ilya Salmon write about
Yeah,
how much voters know.
yeah,
Right. And I'm talking voters now that have internet and books and whatever, and haven't just fought a world war and aren't peasant farmers and that type of thing. It seems like a stretch to think that a lot of the people who were following Lenin understood the theory of Karl Marx. Um,
very little, it seems.
yeah.
Certainly going into it, although Lenin realizes this and he's very conscious of it and he tries to change it. So,
Yeah. And again, that this would like this is not solid evidence, but to me, this is more evidence that like he had to find a guy who um, was able to rile people,
yeah,
not somebody who was
a
able to
demagogue.
enlighten. Yeah, exactly, right? So, okay, so you're talking about what ifs. Okay, so this is sort of where your paper, this is pretty much exactly where your paper comes in here, right? So you decided, well, what if the Russian Revolution didn't happen? How popular would Marx have been? And you thought of a really clever way of trying to figure that out. And did you want to say a little bit about either of those things?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely. So, this theory had been posited, and talking with Michael, and we kind of had an aha moment together. I was like, I wonder if there's a way to measure this. And it turns out there is. You can track author names by book citations, the number of times they're referenced in print books. And now we got this great instrument called Google Ngram, which is the scan recognition of all books in the Google Book system. So it's a massive database. And what you can do is you can text search it to see how many times Karl Marx appeared in the year 1873 compared to any other author. And it'll give you basically a equivalent of a percentage of all books published in that year. How many times did Marx get mentioned? And we can mine that. We can scrape the data out of it year after year after year, not only for Marx, but for hundreds of other authors, and plug them into some statistical software to basically engage in comparison. And the program we ran, what it basically does is it searches the other authors that we included in there and tries to match them, figure out other authors that were cited at approximately the same rate or in the same patterns as Karl Marx prior to 1917. So it constructs a synthetic counterfactual of Marx, and then it takes that trend line and projects it forward. And the idea being, if 1917 had never happened, Lenin had never happened, Marx probably would have continued on the same citation pattern he had been in for the 30 years or so before that.
Right.
And that's using other authors. And we see those other authors continue on that same citation pattern, whereas Marx diverges and starts to skyrocket.
Right. So, okay. So before we talk about the skyrocketing, I want to make sure any viewer or listener sort of follows intuitively what it is you're doing too. I don't actually don't remember where I read or heard this, but um, the process you're using, I guess, of this synthetic Karl Marx, right? It's called. You're
Yeah,
building a synthetic Karl Marx, has been done in things like, well, look, if you want to find out what would have happened to, I'll just pick a random. I'm going to pick a Canadian province because I'm Canadian. That's what
sure, sure.
if Alberta never instituted the minimum wage,
Right,
right?
right.
What would things look like? And then we can look at other provinces that would have been Alberta that didn't institute the minimum wage and compare what would have happened compared to what really happened with Alberta.
Yeah.
Same type of thing, right?
Another
Same.
thing is it's
Yeah.
a tool for detecting counterfactuals, for inferring what's the causal mechanism here by using data. And what you normally need is a really discretely defined event and lots of data on either side of the event. So you can see if that event occurs and it causes a trajectory of something, or is posited to cause a trajectory of something to change, you can actually test that by comparing it to other data points.
Okay, so like in my example, I had like Alberta, and then we could say maybe this is totally fictitious, but like British Columbia and
Mhm,
Ontario were the other.
mhm.
Um, who would have been the British Columbia and Ontario for Karl Marx?
Right. So it's Ferdinand Lassalle, one of his great rivals.
Okay,
Certainly comes
but
in there. Johann Karl Robertus, who's another democratic socialist that develops the same, almost an identical theory of surplus value. In fact, after Marx dies, Robertus's followers accuse Marx of plagiarizing him, and probably with some reasonable evidence that that occurred. So there's very closely aligned in their theoretical concepts, but these other socialist traditions, they tended to go in a more democratic route. So it's without the violent revolutionary element. Another figure that comes in, although he's kind of a quasi-socialist, quasi-non-socialist, but he has multiple claims. So Henry George, who's the American economist in the late 19th century, actually becomes very, very famous and popular in his own day as like a bestseller, whereas Marx is this obscure figure. Henry George is reasonably well known, and all throughout the late 19th century, George is widely cited everywhere, but George kind of peters off. And in 1917, that's the exact moment when Marx's citations pass Henry George's citations. And then George kind of fades off into he's fairly obscure today, whereas Marx is known everywhere. So you have clear evidence of all these other figures that are socialist competitors to Marx with slight variations on them that could have been, or some group or composite of them could have been the more dominant theories of left-wing socialism today had it not been for Karl Marx. So one of the effects is in 1917, after Lenin elevates Marx, he crowds out all of these other traditions.
right. Oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, I didn't even pick that up. Um, so just to give somebody listening an idea, you say Marx takes off right after the Russian Revolution.
Mhm.
How steep is that curve compared to where he would have been?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So within just a few years, so by the mid to late 1920s, Marx's citation rate has tripled.
Okay.
So it's very rapid, and then it's just like off to the races from there.
Okay. So you're left with a paper, a really clever paper showing from citation data that, you know what, no Russian Revolution, nobody's heard of Karl Marx. Um, you put this paper out there. I mean, look, this is obviously good, solid work. I mean, it's very impressive thinking about how clever it is to even test
Yeah.
this. And so what I assume happened once you put this out there is that everybody read this and went, "Oh, I better think again about why Karl Marx is being assigned in my course," right?
Right. Quite the opposite. We published this. It went through a very rigorous, intensive, multiple years of peer review, multiple rounds of revision. They asked us to do additional statistical testing. Extremely rigorous process to get this published, which is what we'd expect, what we want. It makes the work better.
Mhm.
So we put it out there, and immediately it's like the internet crazies of the Twitterverse. The humanities department on the Twitterverse converges in fury and rage over our thesis. And the weird thing is that rage split into two different camps. They're all sympathetic to Marx, but they're two different camps. The
Okay.
first of those is, I say this is almost half of the critics. They say, well, this thesis is so banally obvious that I don't even understand why they wrote that paper. Of course, Lenin put Marx on the map, and we should be thankful to Lenin for that. It's basically kind of
Okay.
the answer. So you have that camp among the socialists. And the other camp is, no, this is outrageous. This is wrong. Karl Marx tapped the zeitgeist of the 19th century and was always this great uh, philosophical peer to others around him. And as that latter camp actually became much more entrenched in the argument, because it's like well, this is obvious crowd said, okay, there's a paper that said what we already knew, and they just kind of moved on. But the other half that said, no, this is completely wrong, that then they started, rather than reading the paper, engaging with the data, so they start scouring books in the 19th century. And they said, well, aha, I found this time that Max Weber mentioned Marx once. Clearly, therefore, the thesis is wrong. Or I found this other time Thorsten Veblen mentioned Marx once. Clearly, the thesis is wrong. And I'm sitting here kind of scratching my hands. Well, first off, Google Books already has Weber and Veblen and all these other figures that they're using as the one-off excuse included in its corpus. So our data set already accounted for that.
Right.
But it's just a really flimsy line of argument, and it blew up in like internet rage of people who had never read the paper in any full depth, certainly haven't explored things, and then they start accusing us of doing all these other things that we had in fact tested for. They accused us of failing to account for foreign languages. They said, "Well,
No.
Marx writes primarily in German, and you only tested English." I said, "Well, no, wait a minute. Here's the appendix where he also tested in German, and got the same results."
Right.
Just real silly lines of argument coming from people who were dogmatically wedded to the notion that Marx has to be this great thinker or else. And I think part of it is really they come to the realization that their entire worldview is built up on the shoulders of this character who turns out to have been propped up by Lenin. They don't want to live with the fact or the reputational damage of that.
Yeah, that makes. I mean, what I find interesting about the story you just told too is that the second camp of critics actually answers the first camp of critics, right? Because
Exactly.
the first camp's like, "What's the point? Everybody knows that," and the second
Yeah.
camp
Well, turns out, no,
clearly
no, they don't.
doesn't know that. Yeah,
They don't. In fact,
exactly.
they vigorously contest it.
Yeah, okay. I mean, so like as a practical um matter here, like just to summarize all of this, we've got Karl Marx being discounted by and other economists who probably didn't have too much of an axe to grind with him. I mean, he's a relatively unknown guy. There is no USSR. There's no
Right.
Lenin.
No,
And
they're
we
just treating him as an academic work. And it's like, well, this guy, we considered his argument. Here's why it's wrong.
right. We've got evidence of his character flaws, or it's apparently
Yes.
not even rare to find this evidence. Um, and we have evidence that one of the most brutal, horrific regimes in history picked him out of everybody to be their poster child. And this is why he is famous.
Yeah.
And this deters nobody, basically.
That's
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they'll claim it's not true socialism under the Soviet Union. They come up with all
Yeah.
these excuses after the fact, and they do
Right.
that with every brutal, mass murdering, genocidal regime that's adopted Marx as their poster child. Which and there turns out to be there's quite a few of those.
Yeah.
So it's a
Yeah.
it's a recurring pattern. But I think a bit the deeper question there is why do they claim to Marx despite all of this baggage?
Yeah.
And a big part of it is there's a sunk cost and a path dependency. The academic left, and including derivations of Marxism, there's orthodox Marxism that might go in a more traditional Leninist revolutionary style, but there are all these derivations of them that apply Marx on different margins rather than looking at class theory. There, that you have racial divide. So critical theory and critical race theory is a Marxist derivation. It's a school of thought that comes out of Western Marxism. But you have all these academic camps that are wedded to that, and they're coming to the realization that the only reason they're wedded to decades upon decades of Marxist theorizing is because Lenin put them on the map in 1917. And had Lenin never existed, maybe they would have glommed onto some other socialist theorist. But the fact that they picked Marx is because Marx crowds out all other camps and becomes the dominant socialist theorist of that era. And then you have decades of academic work that's stacked on top of it that they built their entire careers on. And in a sense, this paper is kind of revealing not only are their careers stacked on some really flimsy, bad social science work, it's also stacked on top of work that attained its political salience not because of its own intrinsic merit, but because a genocidal regime adopted them as a poster child.
Yeah. That's it's rather disturbing, isn't it?
Yes,
I mean, it makes you wonder about just how malleable people are, right? I mean, you have one would like to think that if you have a state enforced curriculum that forces people to learn about this particular individual, that
yeah,
the humans learning about that individual would be good enough at critical thinking to realize I'm being forced to learn about this person. It doesn't really mean they're great, but it turns out it really works if you
yes,
do that, right? That's I find that a little kind of disturbing to my core, actually.
yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
we have clear evidence. from the
Yeah.
records of the Soviet Union, they definitely propagandized Marx. They mass funded the printing and translation and reproduction of all of his works.
Right. Yeah. Oh boy. Well, I think unless did you have anything? Is there anything else that we should know about that paper?
Well,
That
I can give you a preview. It's the start of a very intensive, data intensive project. Michael and I are both continuing to consider other components of the Marxist story. So we've
oh,
since found evidence of especially in the German language sources. So he soars after 1917, but then he's suppressed in the Nazi era, and then he resumes again when he gets this influx of support in East Germany after it falls behind the Iron Curtain. So there's a like a triple treatment effect that we can see that basically further validates our theory, and we're continuing this method of using citations to measure over time, and the goal is to take it all the way up to the present day and figure out all the different chapters in how Marx was disseminated.
that's incredible. Yeah, I can't wait to see that. And I should say too. I mean, I meant to say this earlier when you mentioned Google Ngram. It's just a fun tool. People
It
should take a
is,
look
yeah,
at because you can really check your own intuitions
yeah,
about is this person popular to me or is this person actually popular? And I've surprised myself a few times by,
absolutely.
like, oh wow, okay, I guess I'm way off. Now, all right, based on the last thing you just said, I got one more question for you, and
Yeah.
and I don't actually mean to compare this guy with Marx, I swear, even though I'm not a big fan of the guy I'm about to mention. Um, Rawls and the Democratic Party, is this
Yeah.
in the works at all?
Rawls will certainly enter into some of our statistical analysis when we get to the later part of the 20th century,
Okay.
because he certainly becomes a prominent thinker in his own right in the 1970s in particular through today.
Yeah,
So yes, I'd be very interested to see the course of his citation pattern and academic adoption.
I'm looking forward to that one. Anything else, Phil, that you wanted to mention that you got going on? I know you got this new position, where
Yeah,
people can
yeah,
find you,
yeah.
your website. You want to plug whatever you want. It's your time.
Check it out at independent.org. Put several of my writings and media and stuff up there, and encourage you to read our work.
All right. Well, thanks again for this, Phil. I had a really fun time with this interview. I hope to get you back on again one day.
Awesome.